Marriages collapse under betrayal. This one stayed alive because of it. They shared a house, a name, and a legal bond that looked ordinary from the outside. Neighbors would have described them as quiet, reserved, private. The kind of couple whose life revealed nothing unusual. No raised voices through the walls, no public arguments, no scenes. That silence was not peace. It was an agreement. From the moment they both understood the truth, the marriage stopped being a relationship and became something else entirely. Not affection, not loyalty, containment. They did not stay together because they wanted to. They stayed because leaving was dangerous. Divorce, in most stories, represents escape, a legal exit, a chance to begin again. In this marriage, divorce meant exposure. It meant paperwork, timelines, disclosures, and scrutiny. It meant systems that ask questions without emotion, systems that do not care about intent, fear, or regret. For them, separation was not freedom. It was collapse. They lived as two people occupying the same space with separate calculations running constantly beneath the surface. Every interaction was measured, every word chosen carefully. Even silence carried meaning. There were no threats spoken aloud. None were needed. Each of them knew something that could end the other's life as they knew it. Careers, freedom, identity. Everything rested on information that could not be taken back once revealed. The marriage became a legal structure holding two dangerous truths in place. On paper, they were husband and wife. In reality, they were custodians of each other's downfall. The house itself reflected this arrangement. Shared spaces existed, but rarely at the same time. Doors closed softly, lights turned off in unused rooms, schedules adjusted to avoid overlap. Not out of hatred, but caution. They had learned that proximity increased risk. Conversation was limited to necessities, logistics, appointments, neutral observations. Anything deeper carried the possibility of implication. A poorly chosen word could reveal awareness. A careless reaction could confirm suspicion. So, they spoke less and listened more. Silence became the safest language they had. The truth was never discussed directly, yet it hovered over every moment. It shaped how they moved through rooms, how they responded to messages, how they planned their days. The knowledge they shared was heavy, and neither of them could set it down without consequences. This was not mutual trust. It was mutual exposure. The paradox defined their existence. Staying together was dangerous. Leaving was worse. They both understood that the marriage functioned as a barrier. As long as it remained intact, certain processes stayed dormant, certain questions remained unasked, certain records stayed untouched. Marriage, for them, was not a symbol of unity. It was a delay. The idea of divorce surfaced occasionally, not as a discussion, but as a presence, a possibility that loomed and then retreated. Each time it came close, both of them recognized the same outcome. Forms would be filed, documents would be reviewed, histories would be examined, and once that began, there would be no way to control where attention landed. They had built their lives carefully, each in their own way. Respectability on one side, control on the other. Both depended on silence. Both depended on the assumption that no one would look too closely. Divorce threatened that assumption. So the marriage remained, not because it worked, but because it prevented something worse. They learned how to coexist without connection, how to share space without sharing lives, how to protect themselves by protecting the structure that trapped them. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. Inside, every moment was governed by calculation. They were not bound by love. They were bound by what they knew. And the knowledge was enough to hold them in place day after day, year after year. Some marriages end in separation. Some end in bitterness. Some end in silence.
This one endured because it had become a container for secrets too dangerous to release. And as long as that container remained intact, they believed they could survive. But every agreement built on silence carries a cost, and every delay, no matter how carefully maintained, brings the moment closer when something shifts, when attention drifts, when systems engage, when containment begins to fail. This was not a story about love lost. It was a story about what happens when marriage becomes a holding pattern for truth, and when the very act of leaving threatens to destroy everything both people have left.
Before the silence, before the calculations, before the marriage became a structure built to contain damage, there was a beginning that looked ordinary. They met during a period when neither of them had much to lose, and that, in hindsight, made all the difference. It was not a dramatic meeting, no carefully staged moment, no instant recognition. They crossed paths through necessity, not destiny. Shared environments, shared pressure, a time when ambition was strong, but resources were limited. They were both trying to build something from very little. At that point in their lives, survival and aspiration were closely linked. Every opportunity felt fragile. Every setback carried weight. They understood each other quickly because they were facing similar constraints, even if their responses to those constraints were different. He was driven by the need to prove legitimacy, to be seen as capable, qualified, deserving of space in rooms that did not easily open to people like him. He worked harder than most, prepared more than necessary, spoke less than others, listening carefully, storing information. She was driven by control, by the understanding that systems reward those who know how to move within them quietly. She paid attention to details others ignored. She remembered names, processes, timing. She learned how things worked not by asking questions, but by observing patterns. They recognized something useful in each other. That recognition was the foundation. In the early days, their bond was practical as much as emotional. They supported each other because support increased their chances. Shared meals meant fewer expenses. Shared plans meant less uncertainty. They learned to rely on one another without fully revealing themselves. Trust was built slowly, but it was selective. They spoke about goals more than values, about outcomes more than methods, about what they wanted to achieve, not always how they intended to get there. At the time, this did not feel dishonest. It felt efficient. They dreamed together in broad strokes: stability, recognition, security, a life that did not require constant anxiety about the next month, the next year. They wanted to belong in a world that seemed designed to keep them at the margins. And like many people under pressure, they made compromises, small ones at first. Nothing that seemed permanent, nothing that felt like a line that could not be uncrossed. Decisions framed as temporary solutions to immediate problems, choices justified by circumstance. He encountered barriers that credentials could solve faster than experience alone. She encountered systems that rewarded documentation more than explanation. Each found ways to navigate obstacles without confronting them directly. They did not share every detail, but they shared enough to feel connected, enough to feel supported, enough to believe that whatever was being postponed could be resolved later. They believed honesty could wait. There was always a later, after things settled, after stability was secured, after the pressure eased. They told themselves they would return to the truth when it was safe. Love, they believed, would carry them there. Their relationship deepened through shared routines rather than shared confessions. They learned each other's habits, preferences, reactions to stress. They knew when to speak and when to remain quiet. They became skilled at anticipating each other's needs without having to ask. This created intimacy, but also concealment. They did not argue much. Disagreements were handled carefully,
often deferred. Harmony mattered. Stability mattered. They were building something fragile, and neither wanted to disrupt it with questions that might lead to answers they were not ready to face. The first lies were small, a detail omitted, a timeline adjusted, an explanation simplified. None of it felt dangerous at the time. Each omission was justified by context, by necessity, by the belief that disclosure would only complicate things unnecessarily. They told themselves they were protecting each other from worry. They believed that love meant shielding, and so they shielded from each other. As their lives began to improve, the lies did not disappear. They settled into place, became part of the structure. Not active deceptions, but unexamined assumptions, foundations that no one thought to inspect because the building above them seemed stable. They married during this phase of improvement, not impulsively, but confidently. The marriage felt like a logical extension of what they had already built, a mutual reliance, a shared declaration that they were moving forward together. The wedding did not mark a beginning. It marked a consolidation. By then, they were already intertwined financially, emotionally, and socially. Marriage simplified certain processes. It created legitimacy. It provided structure. It reduced questions from the outside. Inside, it created new ones, but quietly. They believed marriage would allow time to straighten things out, time to adjust, time to reconcile ambition with honesty. They did not consider that time could work in the opposite direction. As responsibilities grew, so did the cost of correction. As careers advanced, as records accumulated, as external recognition increased, the idea of revisiting earlier decisions became less appealing. The truth was no longer just personal, it was structural. Each success made retreat more complicated. Each achievement raised the stakes. The lies that once felt harmless now supported systems that depended on them remaining intact. They noticed this individually, but not together. They continued to operate under the shared assumption that love would compensate, that commitment would justify silence, that as long as they stayed aligned, the details didn't matter. This belief held for a while. They shared moments of genuine connection, laughter, familiarity, the comfort that comes from knowing someone's rhythms. Those moments reinforced the idea that whatever was being postponed could be postponed later. Survival felt mutual, but survival is demanding. It requires constant adjustment, constant assessment of risk. Over time, the emotional energy required to maintain appearances begins to replace the energy once reserved for affection. They began to notice changes. He grew more cautious, more attentive to paperwork, timing, verification. She grew more precise, more protective of records, accounts, access. Each adjustment made sense individually. Together, they created distance. Not emotional distance at first, but informational distance. They stopped asking certain questions, not because they didn't care, but because they sensed the answers would complicate things. Curiosity was replaced by restraint. Concern was replaced by trust in silence. The relationship remained functional, but it was no longer transparent. And transparency, once lost, is rarely recovered accidentally. They reached a point where each believed the other knew less than they did. That belief provided comfort. It allowed them to continue without confrontation, without renegotiation. They did not realize they were both wrong. The stage was set quietly over years. No single decision defined the shift. No dramatic betrayal marked the change. Just a series of choices made under pressure, reinforced by success, and protected by mutual avoidance. Looking back, the question becomes unavoidable. At what point does survival replace affection? Not suddenly, not intentionally, but gradually through decisions that feel reasonable in the moment. By the time they realized something had changed, the marriage was no longer simply a partnership. It was a system, and systems resist disruption. They had built something that worked until it didn't. And when the truth finally emerged, it would not arrive as a revelation, but as a recognition that the love they once relied on to excuse silence had been replaced, not by hatred, not by resentment, but by the careful, relentless logic of survival.
Respectability is often assumed to be solid, stable, earned, verified. In his case, it was assembled. The husband did not enter his profession through the path most people followed. There was no clean sequence of qualification, certification, and approval that unfolded exactly as described in official guidelines. His entry came during a moment of pressure, when opportunity appeared faster than legitimacy could keep up. He had the knowledge, he had the competence. What he lacked was time. The profession he sought demanded documentation that he did not yet possess, and the window to secure the position was narrow. Waiting would mean losing the chance entirely. Someone else would step in, someone with the right papers, regardless of whether they had the ability to do the work. He told himself the discrepancy was temporary, a stopgap, a delay between capability and recognition. The credentials he presented were not entirely fictional. They were assembled from fragments of truth, modified just enough to pass initial review. Names aligned closely with real institutions. Dates were adjusted to fit requirements. The documents looked correct because they were designed to resemble what the system expected, and the system accepted them. That moment, quiet, procedural, almost invisible, changed the course of his life. Once inside, he worked relentlessly, arrived early, left late, volunteered for tasks others avoided. He learned policies faster than his peers, anticipated needs before they were expressed. His performance became his shield. Consistency replaced scrutiny. Supervisors saw results. Colleagues saw reliability. Over time, his presence felt natural, expected, unquestioned. This was the most dangerous phase, because success creates comfort, and comfort reduces inspection. He built his reputation carefully, understanding that visibility could be both asset and risk. He did not seek attention, but he did not refuse recognition. Each positive review reinforced the assumption that everything about him was in order. On the surface, he was indistinguishable from those who had followed the approved path. Underneath, every routine process carried weight. Verification cycles, credential renewals, internal audits. These were ordinary occurrences for everyone else. For him, they were moments of intense awareness. He prepared obsessively. Copies of documents were stored in multiple places. Digital files were organized precisely. He memorized timelines, rehearsed explanations that could account for minor discrepancies if they were ever questioned. He learned which procedures were automated and which involved human review, which departments communicated with each other and which operated independently. He studied the system not out of ambition, but necessity. His professionalism was not an act, it was armor. Every morning he adjusted himself before entering the world. His tone, his posture, his responses. He understood that hesitation could be read as uncertainty, and uncertainty invited questions. So he eliminated hesitation. At work, he was calm, measured, helpful. The person others relied on, the person no one suspected. The anxiety existed, but it remained internal. It appeared in his habits, double-checking submissions, refreshing portals after sending documents, monitoring notifications more closely than required. He slept lightly during verification periods,
waking at the slightest alert. This vigilance became normal to him. He told himself everyone felt this way, but they didn't. At home, the weight followed him, not as confession, but as tension. His wife noticed the patterns long before she understood their cause. She noticed how his mood shifted during certain times of the year, how he became quieter when administrative emails arrived, how he reviewed documents repeatedly before submitting them, even when the content was routine. She noticed his attention to details sharpen in specific contexts, his interest in institutional procedures, his questions about how records were stored, accessed, and reviewed. At first, she interpreted this as ambition, caution, professional pride. But the pattern persisted. The anxiety did not fade with success. It intensified. As his position became more secure, the consequences of exposure grew heavier. Early in his career, discovery would have meant disappointment. Now, it would mean collapse. Everything he had built depended on documentation remaining unquestioned. His identity in professional terms existed because of files. Not truth, not intention, files. He understood this deeply. That understanding shaped how he lived. He avoided situations that required excessive disclosure, declined opportunities that involved additional verification, managed his network carefully, ensuring that no one looked too closely at his background. He learned how to redirect attention without raising suspicion, how to comply while revealing only what was necessary. This constant management required energy that once belonged to the relationship. His wife felt the shift gradually, not as a revelation, but as a growing sense that something fundamental was being guarded, not from the world, but from her. She observed his behavior during moments of perceived risk, how his posture changed when certain topics arose, how he redirected conversations away from his past, how he avoided discussing specifics about his qualifications, even in casual settings. She did not accuse, she watched. And as she watched, pieces began to align. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, through repetition. A document handled with unusual care, an answered with precision, but no elaboration. A story about early career years that remained vague. She began to understand that his confidence rested on something fragile. She did not yet know the details, but she understood the stakes. For him, every background check represented potential erasure, not just of a job, of status, of credibility, of the identity he had constructed so carefully. One verification could undo years of effort. He lived with that knowledge constantly. And yet, he could not stop, because to step away would invite questions of a different kind. Why leave now? Why change direction after such success? Why abandon a path that appeared stable? Movement itself became risky. So he stayed, and worked, and maintained. The double life was not a separate existence. There were no dramatic shifts, no alternate personas. It was a single life layered with awareness that others did not share. He was competent, he was capable, he was also vulnerable. The irony was unavoidable. He had become exactly what the profession claimed to value: reliable, effective, respected. And yet, his foundation was something the same system would reject instantly if discovered. This contradiction shaped everything. At home, the distance between him and his wife widened subtly, not emotionally at first, but informationally. He shared less about work, less about processes, less about plans. She noticed. She began to realize that his silence was not casual. It was protective. And protection implies threat. She did not confront him. She did not need to. Understanding was enough. The moment she grasped the nature of his vulnerability, the marriage shifted again. Because now the knowledge was no longer one-sided. She understood that his entire professional identity existed at the mercy of documentation, that legitimacy for him was not inherent, it was conditional. And conditions can change. For him, the fear never fully surfaced in words. It lived in his routines, his caution, his controlled demeanor. He continued to perform well, to advance carefully, to maintain the appearance of stability. But inside, he knew the truth. He had built a life on paper, and paper can be questioned. The profession he occupied did not know him as a person. It knew him as a file, a sequence of approvals, a collection of verified details. As long as those details remained intact, he existed within the system. If they did not, he vanished. That awareness followed him everywhere. It followed him into meetings, into decisions, into his marriage. And once his wife began to see the shape of that awareness,
While his life depended on documents that should never be questioned, hers depended on documents that could never disappear. Her involvement with financial misconduct did not begin as an act of defiance or greed. It began as problem-solving, as adaptation, as response to systems that rewarded distance, complexity, and plausible deniability more than honesty or effort. She learned early that money rarely moves in straight lines. It moves through people, through structures, through names that are not always the ones you expect. Her first exposure to indirect transactions came through observation. She noticed how accounts were layered, how ownership could be separated from control, how responsibility could be distributed just enough to avoid clear attribution. She paid attention to what passed unnoticed and what attracted attention, and she learned. Proxy accounts became tools, not because she wanted anonymity, but because she needed flexibility. Accounts tied to secondary identities, not invented, but borrowed. Names that existed, entities that had purpose beyond her own needs. Each layer created distance. Distance created time. Time created safety. Indirect transfers followed, not sudden movements that might attract interest, but gradual shifts that blended into larger flows. She understood volume, frequency, timing. She understood that repetition without variation invited review, while variation within acceptable ranges passed quietly. Her involvement deepened as her confidence grew, not recklessly, methodically. She documented everything, every transaction, every access point, every authorization. This was not carelessness, it was design. She did not trust memory, she trusted records, because memory fails under pressure, records do not. The evidence of her activities existed in multiple forms, some physical, some digital, some secured within institutions that promised confidentiality through process rather than discretion. Safe deposit boxes, encrypted storage, archived correspondence. Each record served a purpose, not to revisit the past, to control the future. This was the crucial difference between her and others who had made similar choices. She did not believe that erasure equaled safety. Removing records created absence. Absence raised questions. Absence forced reconstruction. Preservation, on the other hand, allowed control. If a record exists, it can be managed. If it disappears, it must be explained. She chose management. The evidence was never meant to be revealed publicly. It was not a confession waiting to happen. It was leverage, secured and preserved intentionally. She didn't keep records to remember. She kept them to survive. Each document was a shield as much as a risk. It established context. It proved sequence.
It demonstrated intent within a framework that could be explained if necessary. She understood that systems are less interested in morality than in consistency. Records provide consistency. Her identities were layered carefully, not to hide completely, but to distribute presence. Each identity carried a portion of activity, never enough on its own to invite scrutiny. Together, they formed a complete picture, but only if assembled intentionally. And no one had assembled them, yet. Her control over documentation gave her a sense of stability. While others feared exposure, she relied on preparedness. She knew exactly where every record was stored. She tracked access. She reviewed logs. She ensured that any movement, any inquiry would be noticed. This vigilance became routine. It shaped her daily habits, her approach to communication, her relationship with institutions. She spoke their language, followed their procedures, never rushed, never resisted openly. Compliance was another layer of protection. From the outside, she appeared meticulous, organized, conservative in risk, no sudden changes, no visible ambition that might draw attention. But beneath that presentation was a web of transactions that required constant maintenance. She accepted that cost. Control demanded effort. What made her different was not the scale of her actions, but her philosophy. She did not believe she could outsmart systems forever. She believed she could coexist with them. By documenting everything, she positioned herself not as an anomaly, but as a participant with records ready for explanation. She understood that when attention eventually arrived, it would seek coherence, not confession, and she intended to provide coherence. The records were her language. When her husband's behavior began to shift, when she noticed his careful management of paperwork, his sensitivity to verification cycles, his unease around institutional processes, she recognized something familiar. He, too, was living within systems, but differently. Where she preserved evidence, he avoided it. Where she layered documentation, he relied on continuity. Where she planned for attention, he hoped to delay it. This difference mattered. She realized that his vulnerability lay in absence, in gaps, in documents that could not be reinforced because they should not exist. Her vulnerability, by contrast, lay in abundance. Too many records, if assembled, could reveal the full scope of her actions, but as long as they remained distributed, controlled, and contextualized, they worked in her favor. This understanding shaped how she viewed the marriage. She began to see it not as a partnership of shared risk, but as an alignment of complementary exposures. His depended on non-examination, hers depended on managed examination. The evidence she kept was not only about her actions, it was about timing. If ever confronted, she needed to know when, by whom, through which channel, and with what scope. The records allowed her to respond deliberately. They allowed her to negotiate, not verbally, but procedurally. She never spoke about this openly, not to friends, not to colleagues, not to her husband, but she understood that knowledge itself is power, and knowledge once shared cannot be reclaimed, so she kept it contained. As the marriage progressed, her sense of control grew alongside her awareness of his fragility. She did not see this as advantage initially. It was simply recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that they were not equal in how their risks operated. This did not make her careless. It made her cautious. She adjusted her documentation practices, ensured redundancy, verified access points, updated encryption, reviewed institutional policies to anticipate procedural changes. She stayed current because systems evolve. What was secure yesterday may invite questions tomorrow. The records were living things. They required attention. She did not fear them. She relied on them. The irony was clear. What others would consider incriminating, she considered stabilizing. Evidence in her hands was not a confession, it was insurance, and as she became more aware of her husband's situation, of the delicate balance he maintained through performance and consistency, she recognized the imbalance in their marriage. If exposed, he would be unmade instantly. If examined, she would negotiate. This difference did not make her reckless, it made her deliberate. She understood that the marriage itself had become another layer of documentation, a legal bond that shaped how institutions perceived both of them, a structure that delayed certain questions and activated others. Marriage, like records, is a form of containment. She treated it accordingly. The evidence remained secured, the systems remained navigated, the balance remained intact, for now. But evidence, even when controlled, has weight, and weight over time affects everything it supports. She knew this, which is why she never destroyed a single record, because destruction suggests fear, preservation suggests preparation. She didn't keep records to remember, she kept them to survive. And survival, as she had learned, depends not on hiding the truth, but on being ready when it is finally requested.
There is a moment in some marriages when certainty replaces suspicion. Not through confession, not through discovery laid out plainly, but through recognition. For them, that moment did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, through timing, phrasing, and restraint. By this point, both had noticed changes in the other, adjustments too precise to ignore. Caution where comfort once existed, awareness where trust had once filled the gaps. Neither asked questions directly. Questions invite answers. Answers create records. Instead, they observed. He noticed how she began to reference institutions casually, a comment about bank hours, a remark about verification processes, a passing mention of how long records are retained. None of it accusatory, none of it explanatory, but none of it accidental. She noticed how he handled documents with increased care, how he delayed routine submissions, how he avoided certain administrative conversations, how his professionalism became almost ceremonial. They spoke less, and when they did speak, every word carried weight. A sentence about work schedules could hold warning. A remark about paperwork could signal awareness. A pause could confirm what neither wanted stated aloud. This was not confrontation, it was alignment. The realization did not strike them simultaneously, but it settled evenly. A shared understanding formed, without agreement, without negotiation. They both knew, and they both knew that the other knew. The marriage shifted in that space, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. Where affection once filled silence, calculation now did. Where care once shaped responses, assessment took its place. They began to speak around truths rather than toward them. A casual observation at dinner, a neutral comment during routine planning, a suggestion that carried implication rather than intent. Each exchange served as a test, not to provoke reaction, but to confirm boundaries. Silence became a response, not avoidance, confirmation. When one mentioned something that brushed too close to exposure, the other did not object, did not deny, did not explain. They simply acknowledged the statement and moved on. This was how they confirmed the new rules. No accusations, no threats, no declarations, because any of those would collapse the containment they now shared. They understood that speaking plainly would force choices neither could afford to make. Instead, they communicated through implication. A remark about how systems retain information for years. A comment about how credentials are sometimes reviewed without warning. A suggestion that documentation, once examined, speaks for itself. None of it directed, all of it received. Each understood the risk of escalation. Each understood that clarity would be catastrophic. The marriage transformed into something else entirely. Not a partnership, not an alliance, but a containment structure. Each held something that limited the other's movement. This knowledge changed how they occupied shared spaces. The house became quieter, not tense, but deliberate. They moved carefully around each other, as if both were aware that sudden motion could upset a delicate balance. There were no arguments. Arguments create witnesses. There were no emotional appeals. Emotion invites mistakes. Instead, there was routine. Routine preserved distance. They coordinated schedules with efficiency. They managed appearances. They maintained the image of stability, because instability invites inquiry. Publicly, they were unchanged. Privately, everything had shifted. Love, once expressed through gesture and attention, dissolved into calculation. Not because affection vanished instantly, but because affection became irrelevant. Affection could not protect them. Information could. They stopped asking personal questions. They stopped offering reassurance. They stopped sharing concerns, because sharing creates vulnerability, and vulnerability, once recognized, becomes leverage. Marriage in this new form was no longer about mutual support. It was about mutual restraint. Each knew exactly how far the other could move without triggering consequences. Each understood the limits, and so they stayed within them. This was not hatred. Hatred seeks damage. This was preservation. Preservation seeks control. They learned to read each other's silences. A delayed response could signal caution. A change in tone could signal awareness. A refusal to engage could signal boundary. They adapted. Meals became procedural, conversations functional, decisions measured. There were no more plans that extended too far into the future. The future required stability. Stability required containment. They did not discuss separation. The word itself became dangerous. Even hypothetical mention carried risk, because separation implied processes. Processes implied review. Review implied exposure. The idea of divorce transformed from a concept of freedom into a symbol of collapse. They both understood this without ever stating it. The marriage, paradoxically, became strongest at the moment it ceased to be emotional, because now it served a purpose. It held two fragile lives in balance. Each recognized that the other was not merely a spouse, but a constraint, a limit, a boundary enforced by knowledge. This realization reshaped how they saw one another. He no longer viewed her as unpredictable or threatening. He viewed her as informed. She no longer viewed him as careless or naive. She viewed him as exposed. These perceptions created a form of respect, not admiration, acknowledgement. They had entered a phase where neither could act independently. Every decision now passed through an internal calculation. What does this reveal? What does this trigger? What does this allow the other to infer? The marriage became a closed system. Information entered carefully. Information exited rarely. Silence was not emptiness, it was structure. They avoided direct eye contact during sensitive moments, not out of fear, but out of discipline. They understood that too much recognition could invite misinterpretation. Even emotional moments were managed. When stress appeared, it was redirected. When concern surfaced, it was neutralized. They did not comfort each other anymore. Comfort suggests trust. Trust was no longer an option. They had reached a stage where both understood that love could no longer guide decisions. Love had been replaced by strategy. Strategy required distance, and distance required maintenance. The irony was clear. They had known each other more completely, and they had never been further apart. The marriage, now stripped of illusion, functioned as a mutual containment unit. Each stayed not because they wanted to, but because leaving would activate forces neither could control. This understanding settled into daily life. It shaped how they planned, how they spoke, how they stayed silent.
They had not agreed to this arrangement, they had recognized it, and recognition, once shared, becomes binding. The marriage no longer needed affection to survive. It needed restraint, it needed discipline, it needed both parties to understand that movement in any direction carried cost. And so they remained, not together in the way they once were, but contained, bound not by love, but by what they knew. And in that knowledge, the marriage found a stability that affection could no longer provide. A stability built on implication, on silence, on the unspoken understanding that exposure waited on the other side of separation. Marriage had become leverage, and neither could afford to let it go.
By the time the idea of separation moved from implication to planning, both of them understood the risk. Divorce was no longer an emotional decision, it was a procedural event, and procedures leave trails. They did not announce anything, they did not argue, they did not even agree openly that separation would be pursued. Instead, they began with careful inquiries, framed as hypotheticals, quiet conversations held behind closed doors, questions asked without commitment. What would the process require? Which documents would be reviewed? How far back would records be examined? The answers came calmly, professionally, without suspicion, which made them more dangerous because the process itself assumed transparency. The first lawyer did not accuse, did not probe aggressively, but something subtle happened during the initial consultation. A pause lingered after reviewing basic information. A request was made for clarification that seemed routine but carried weight. Dates needed confirmation. Employment histories required alignment. Financial disclosures had to be comprehensive. The lawyer explained that this was standard, and it was. That was the problem. Standard procedure offered no protection for people whose lives depended on irregularity remaining unnoticed. They withdrew without committing. The second attempt was more cautious. Another professional, another conversation framed as exploratory. Again, nothing overt, but again, the same pattern emerged. Questions overlapped across systems. Documents referenced one another. Timelines were expected to match. No resistance was expressed, only process. The system did not say no, it said proceed carefully, and careful in this context meant exposure. They began to realize that divorce could not be initiated quietly. Even discretion created records. Every consultation logged, every inquiry noted, every draft document saved. Each step added data to systems designed to preserve information indefinitely. Cooperation itself became a risk, because cooperation required disclosure, and disclosure required accuracy. Accuracy was something neither could guarantee across every system now involved. They began to stall, not overtly, procedurally. Requests for time, clarification sought, questions deferred. The lawyers noticed, not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because the behavior diverged from expectation. Clients seeking separation typically move forward. Hesitation invites curiosity. Curiosity leads to caution. Caution leads to documentation. The lawyers did not threaten, they advised. They explained that inconsistencies, if discovered later, could complicate proceedings. That full disclosure at the outset was safer. Safer for whom? The couple understood that the legal process was not hostile, it was thorough. And thoroughness leaves no room for controlled ambiguity. Paperwork became dangerous, forms that required declarations, affidavits that demanded affirmation, statements that would be compared against existing records. Every signature would bind them to a version of reality that systems would preserve. They did not fight over terms, they fought over timing. Delays were framed as prudence, as reconsideration, as logistical complexity. But delays create their own signals. The longer the process remained unresolved, the more attention it drew. Institutions are designed to notice stagnation. Files flagged for follow-up, reminders issued, requests repeated. The system moved forward even when they did not. This was the escalation, not through confrontation, but through persistence. They attempted cooperation as camouflage, offering partial compliance, providing information slowly, responding without commitment. But cooperation, when incomplete, creates discrepancy. Discrepancy invites reconciliation. Reconciliation invites review. Every attempt to manage the process added complexity rather than control. The marriage itself became evidence, not of affection, of delay. The legal system does not interpret silence as neutrality, it interprets it as unresolved risk. Lawyers began to sense something was wrong, not because of specific facts, but because of pattern. Questions answered carefully but incompletely, documents provided selectively, timelines that required adjustment. No single issue raised alarm, but accumulation created concern. Professionals are trained to notice when clients are protecting something. Protection suggests liability. They advised caution, they advised clarity, they advised resolution, all of which carried risk. The couple found themselves trapped between movement and exposure. Initiating divorce would activate systems designed to examine truth. Avoiding divorce would keep the property locked and attention growing. The process itself became the threat. No one needed to accuse them. The system only needed to function. Every legal step created new exposure paths. Financial disclosures intersected with employment records. Employment records intersected with certification databases. Marital records intersected with inheritance files. Each intersection reduced the space where ambiguity could survive. They realized that the legal system did not need intention to cause damage. It did not need suspicion. It only needed participation. The divorce could not happen because it required too much alignment across systems that never were aligned intentionally. The marriage itself, once a shield, now became the reason they could not move. They stayed, not because they wanted to, but because separation would force a level of scrutiny neither could survive. The pressure intensified, deadlines approached, notices followed, administrative patience waned. The lawyers requested progress. They responded with restraint. The silence that had once protected them now worked against them, because silence within a process is interpreted as delay, and delay invites escalation. They found themselves negotiating not with each other, but with systems that demanded resolution. The marriage was no longer a private arrangement. It was a public status blocking procedural closure. They could feel control slipping, not through force, but through obligation. Obligation backed by documentation. The divorce that could not happen became a constant presence, a looming process they could neither initiate nor abandon. Every attempt to manage it exposed another vulnerability. Every pause made the situation more visible. They learned a final uncomfortable truth. Systems do not need conflict to cause collapse. They only need compliance. And compliance was now unavoidable. The marriage remained intact, not as a choice, but as a containment strategy that was losing effectiveness by the day. The divorce could not happen, and that impossibility was becoming the most dangerous fact of all.
Containment works only as long as it remains internal. For years, everything dangerous about their lives stayed within carefully defined boundaries, within the marriage, within chosen institutions, within systems they believed they understood well enough to manage. What changed was not their behavior. What changed was attention. It arrived quietly, without warning, without accusation, without explanation. A delay appeared where none had existed before. A routine request for confirmation took longer than expected. An automated response replaced a familiar one. A process that once moved smoothly paused, then resumed with additional steps attached. At first, these moments seemed isolated. A bank transaction that required secondary verification, a document request that referenced an older record, a routine inquiry that expanded its scope without comment. None of it was alarming on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Third parties began to notice inconsistencies,
not as conclusions, but as questions. And questions are how systems apply pressure. A bank employee paused over a familiar name, not because it stood out dramatically, but because it had appeared before under slightly different circumstances. Memory is not perfect, but repetition sharpens recognition. The employee did not report anything immediately. There was no reason to. Instead, the name lingered. The dates did not align as expected. The access history suggested continuity where there should have been separation. The employee made a note, not an accusation, a reminder. That note changed how future interactions unfolded. Verification delays followed. Requests were routed differently. Approvals took longer. Access required additional confirmation. The systems did not explain these changes. They never do. Systems respond to internal thresholds invisible to the people affected by them. Documents began to surface unexpectedly. A copy of a record appeared attached to an unrelated request. A reference number linked two files that had never been connected before. A date from years earlier re-entered circulation. These were not errors, they were outputs, the result of systems comparing information and adjusting behavior accordingly. Control began to slip, not dramatically, but incrementally. The couple noticed that responses to inquiries grew more formal, less flexible, less personal. Institutional language replaced familiarity. They could feel the shift, not as panic, as narrowing. The spaces where ambiguity once lived began to shrink. They attempted to compensate. More caution, less movement, fewer interactions. But reduction also attracts attention. Inactivity, when observed, suggests risk. Systems are designed to notice deviation, and deviation does not require no-doing. It only requires difference. A document was accessed without explanation, not stolen, not altered, simply viewed. Access logs recorded it. Someone, somewhere, had reason to look. They would never know who initiated it, only that it happened. That knowledge changed everything. Containment relies on predictability. Once access becomes opaque, control weakens. They began to realize that their understanding of the systems they relied on was incomplete, not because they misunderstood the rules, but because the rules evolve. Records are not static. They are dynamic participants in processes designed to reconcile inconsistency. A timeline that once existed in isolation now intersected with another. An identity previously separate now overlapped with a second record. No single person assembled the full picture. The systems did. And systems do not need context. They need alignment. Verification delays multiplied. Each delay triggered follow-up. Each follow-up created documentation. Each document increased visibility. They began to feel the loss of containment, not as exposure yet, as momentum. Secrets, once stable, began to move. Movement creates friction. Friction creates heat. Heat draws attention. They attempted to regain control by reviewing their own records, cross-checking, confirming, ensuring consistency. But this effort revealed something unsettling. Some of the information they relied on had already been updated, not changed, contextualized. Annotations appeared where none had existed before, notes referencing other files, cross-references embedded quietly into records they believed were static. The systems were talking to each other, not about them, through them. The bank employee did not escalate, the lawyer did not accuse, the institutions did not confront, yet the pressure increased. Because once systems begin to align, they rarely stop. Control does not disappear suddenly, it erodes. One process no longer behaves as expected, another requires clarification, another introduces delay.
each deviation small, together destabilizing. They began to understand that secrecy does not fail because of dramatic revelation. It fails because of accumulation. The accumulation of attention, the accumulation of records, the accumulation of minor inconsistencies that demand reconciliation. They could no longer predict outcomes, and unpredictability in systems is dangerous. They adjusted again, reduced communication, avoided new engagements, paused decisions. But avoidance itself became visible. Files marked as inactive but unresolved. Cases flagged for review. The systems did not accuse, they prepared. This was the psychological weight they could not escape. The realization that something had begun moving without their input, that the secrets they had contained were now gaining momentum. Not propelled by malice, by procedure. Loss of containment does not announce itself. It reveals itself through subtle shifts, a form that takes longer to process, a response that includes additional recipients, a request that references information from another domain. The marriage, once the central containment, could no longer absorb this pressure. External attention had entered the equation, and once it does, control becomes provisional. They were no longer managing risk alone, they were reacting, and reaction, unlike strategy, leaves traces. The systems noticed, they always do, not because they intend to uncover anything, but because alignment requires resolution. The secrets were no longer still, they were in motion, and motion, once initiated, does not require intent to continue. The couple understood that the most dangerous phase had begun, not exposure, approach, the phase where containment weakens and momentum builds, where silence no longer stabilizes, where systems begin to lean toward clarity. The loss of containment was not dramatic, it was procedural, and it was irreversible, because once attention arrives, it rarely leaves without answers, and answers, in their world, carried consequences they could no longer fully control.
There comes a point when containment stops feeling like control and starts feeling like delay. For them, that moment arrived quietly, not with an argument, not with urgency in the voice, but with a decision made internally, without discussion. One of them concluded that waiting was no longer an option. The balance had shifted too far. External attention had grown. Systems were no longer behaving as expected. Records were moving, being referenced, being aligned in ways that reduced flexibility. The conclusion was simple. If exposure was approaching, then position mattered, and position required action. The move was not dramatic. It did not involve confrontation or threats. It involved preparation. Evidence was duplicated, not stolen, not destroyed, repositioned. Copies placed where access could be controlled differently. Records that once existed only within a single institution were mirrored in another format. Digital trails backed up in ways that changed who could retrieve them and how quickly. This was not an attempt to reveal anything. It was an attempt to secure advantage. The belief was clear. If the evidence could be controlled, then outcomes could be negotiated. If leverage could be repositioned, then survival could be managed. The move was calculated. Timing was chosen carefully, not during moments of heightened attention, but during routine transitions, periods when systems update, when oversight is distributed, when human review is minimal. The spouse believed this was the final adjustment needed, a way to stabilize what had begun to shift. But systems do not respond to intention, they respond to activity. The moment evidence was duplicated, new interactions occurred. Access logs updated, metadata changed, references created, automated processes noticed, not immediately, but inevitably. The duplication triggered alignment routines designed to detect redundancy. The repositioning intersected with verification protocols meant to ensure consistency across records.
No alarm sounded, no warning issued, but processes began to intersect. The systems reacted independently. One flagged duplication for routine review, another updated a reference index, another cross-checked access patterns. None of these actions were aggressive, they were procedural. Together, they created a convergence. The spouse believed advantage had been secured. Control felt closer again. For a brief moment, the sense of agency returned, but that sense was based on an outdated assumption that systems respond in isolation. They do not. They communicate. Automated processes intersected in ways no individual could anticipate. A review scheduled in one department aligned with a maintenance update in another. A routine audit coincided with a verification delay elsewhere. The systems did not coordinate, they converged. This convergence triggered exposure, not through accusation, but through confirmation. Records aligned too cleanly, timelines matched too precisely. Inconsistencies that had once remained distributed were now visible within a single framework. The exposure did not come from the spouse. There was no betrayal, no revelation, no intentional harm. The downfall was external, triggered by systems responding exactly as designed. The duplication meant to secure leverage instead created coherence. Coherence removes ambiguity, and ambiguity was the only thing that had protected them. The spouse realized this too late. The final move did not shift balance, it collapsed it. The evidence no longer functioned as leverage, it became context. Context that systems could interpret without guidance. The marriage, once a buffer, could no longer absorb the impact. The final move had been made, and it had activated forces that could not be reversed. The end did not arrive with noise, it arrived with procedure. Notifications were issued, reviews initiated, processes escalated. The marriage collapsed quietly, not through confrontation, not through public scenes, but through absence, the absence of protection. The legal bond that had once delayed scrutiny now accelerated it. Separation became unavoidable, not as choice, but as consequence. The systems no longer waited. The marriage no longer mattered. Legal protection dissolved not because it failed, but because it had completed its function. Once records aligned, once verification concluded, the status that had shielded them became irrelevant. Careers began to fracture, not all at once, incrementally. A role placed under review, a credential questioned, an opportunity withdrawn. Reputations did not shatter publicly, they eroded quietly. Emails stopped arriving, invitations ceased, conversations changed tone. No single event marked the fall. It was a sequence of adjustments, each justified, each documented, each irreversible. There was no clear winner. The spouse who attempted control gained nothing. The spouse who remained silent lost protection. Leverage became liability. The records that once preserved options now defined outcomes. Silence no longer protected, because silence only works when systems lack clarity. Clarity had arrived. The marriage ended without resolution. No closure, no reconciliation, only consequence. They learned something too late, that survival strategies built on containment fail once movement begins, that systems do not need conflict to cause collapse, that evidence, once activated, belongs to no one. Some marriages don't end in love or hate, they end in evidence.